Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 611, and today is June 10th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot of news to talk about on today's show, and this is a little bit interesting because today I got to talk about myself a little bit because a State Department linked group put me on a list of anti-Ukrainians. So we'll be talking about that and more on today's show. I really appreciate if you could take the time to share today's show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and we repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. It's up at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee if you want to see the video version of the show. Of course, you could listen to the audio-only version, and that's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcast. And of course, you can find this show and all the other work I do by following me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. All right, everybody, let's get into it today. The first story up is about that list. Dave DeCamp wrote it up for antiwar.com. State Department linked group smears antiwar.com in new anti-Ukrainian list. So, a State Department linked NGO published a study on June 6th that listed hundreds of individuals and organizations that oppose aid to Ukraine in an effort to smear them for spreading Russian propaganda. The NGO Tetsty, TEXTY.org.ua listed antiwar.com and several of its staff members, including Eric Garris, who's the founder and really the guy who made sure that antiwar.com every day looks as good as it does, and it's all put together for you guys. Scott Horton, who is, of course, the founder of the Libertarian Institute and was the longtime opinion editor of antiwar.com, now the editorial director of antiwar.com, and myself, along with some other antiwar.com contributors, so Dub Bandow, Ted Galen Carpenter, James Carden, Rick Rosaroff, Walt Zotlo, and a few others were also all put on that list. Not Dave DeCamp, interestingly enough. And Dave mentions here that many organizations that work closely with antiwar.com, such as the Libertarian Institute, the Ron Paul Institute, along with Daniel McAdams, Ron Paul, Rand Paul, were all also placed on this list. You also see there are a lot of generic names on this list. I don't think it's any kind of hit list or anything like that. There's a lot of members of Congress, Tucker Carlson, Fox News are all listed here as well. Although we are separate from them in the little heat mapping graphics that they do. They do separate out the libertarians and what they smear says as isolationist from, the rest of the conservative movement, which at least you can appreciate that they get that part of it right. I would add, they also link myself particularly. They link me to antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, which makes sense. And when you click on my name, if you go to the website, it'll just give my bio, the one that I always use, as well as I think 5 or 6 articles that I write are linked on the site, either under my name, under the Libertarian Institute, or under antiwar.com's. I find that, for all of those, the information they present is fairly accurate. So I don't think it's necessarily, that they're smearing me with just linking me to these groups. Although some of the other people's profiles that I noticed did include some smears and just kind of character attacks that seemed unfounded and potentially untrue. It also links me to the Ukraine Peace Coalition, which I wasn't aware that existed. I mean, it sounds good, right? Like, I want peace in Ukraine, right? So I guess that's fine. But from the heat chart map, it links that group to the, Code Pink, Medea Benjamin, Marcy Winograd, and all those folks over there. And I certainly do appreciate what they do. They're leftists and they're anti-war, and I'm happy there's anti-war leftists, and a lot of the activism that goes on in and around Washington DC is tied to Code Pink. So it's not that like I'm ashamed or embarrassed to be necessarily named alongside those ladies. I would just don't want to take credit for any of their work or suggest that I'm really a part of their coalition in any way, as this website does. So TechCamp's website list, I skipped a little part here. The American Conservative, which also is included in the list, reported that Tetsty.org.ua was co-founded by Anatoly Bondrenko, Bondarenko has worked as an instructor for the State Department program known as Tech Camp, which provides training for foreign journalists and activists. Tech Camp's website lists Bondarenko as a trainer for the Ukrainian program that brought together more than 60 local journalists, civil society, community leaders, and private sector partners in Eastern Europe with the goal of helping to increase digital and media literacy. The tetsty.org.ua report is titled Roller Coaster from Trumpist to Communist, the Forces in the U.S. impeding aid to Ukraine and how they do it. The study acknowledges that most of the people listed do not have direct proven ties to the Russian government or propagandists, but it claims that the arguments they use to urge authorities to distance themselves from Ukraine echo key messages of Russian propaganda aimed at depriving Ukrainians the ability to defend themselves with weapons and funds. The report links antiwar.com's Ukraine news page as an example of anti-Ukrainian statements. Other listed people and organizations are from across the political spectrum, former President Donald Trump to Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein, dozens of Republican members of Congress, including Rand Paul, J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, and many others. Media outlets frequently linked to the front page on antiwar.com were also listed, including Responsible Statecraft, The Gray Zone, peace groups including Code Pink, Veterans for Peace, World Beyond War, and others were also smeared. So, I guess the two things I just want to add here, again, I don't think this is a hit list. I saw some people describing it as that. I don't in any way, fear for my safety from being placed on this list. In fact, if you look at every other name on the list, I might be the least recognizable person on there. So, certainly I think I'm kind of one of the bottom or last entries to this list. In a way, I do feel not bad, but I don't want to say honored, but I'm on a list with Ron Rand Paul, J.D. Vance, Daniel McAdams, and so many other people that I read a lot and have looked up to, and so I'm not necessarily super offended to be on this list. My concern is that this is going to be used maybe to create other more serious lists in which I could be included, and then there maybe other concerns that arise from that. And then the second thing is that this will be used maybe to pressure social media companies, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, to censor my content more and to oppress, make sure people don't see what we're saying here. And so I guess in response to this, the only thing I really ask is that if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to the show. It might be worth it to do it in a couple of places. Go ahead and subscribe on YouTube, but subscribe on Rumble as well if you have a Rumble account. Or, make sure you got YouTube and you're following me on Twitter. Both of those sites offer notification bells, which is supposed to give you an actual reminder, a notification when I post something new, rather than, just adding you as a subscriber, but they never actually put my content into your feed. So I would definitely think about doing all those things if you don't want to miss the content that I'm putting out, because it seems somewhat likely to me that I will end up getting kind of depressed in the algorithm because of this over time. All right, next up here is an article I wrote for antiwar.com on June 7th. And, writing stuff like this is the reason I'm sure I got put on the list, as well as my weekly appearances on Judge Andrew Napolitano's Judging Freedom show, which I will be back this week, 2:15 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesday. That is June 12th. So please tune into that if you can. All right, this year, White House announces $225 million weapons package for Ukraine. The Joe Biden administration announced a new $225 million weapons transfer to Ukraine on Friday. The package includes ammunition for HIMARS launchers that Biden recently gave Kiev permission to use for attacks inside of Russia. According to the Department of Defense press release, the U.S. will transfer weapons directly from U.S. stockpiles to Ukraine. Biden authorized the transfer through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which Congress funded in the $95 billion foreign military aid bill passed earlier this year. So I'm just going to go through and read off the list of weapons included in the shipment. And as always, the Pentagon doesn't provide a whole lot of information as far as the different variants. So if a artillery shell is, say, a cluster variant versus just a conventional shell, or what range the HIMARS missiles are, or things like that, they don't provide any of that information. They just give a very general outline of what they're sending. Sometimes we get more information later on from subsequent reporting, but that's not extremely typical either. So this shipment includes missiles for the Hawk air defense system, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, ammunition for HIMARS, 155 millimeter howitzers, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 81 millimeter mortar rounds, M113 armored personnel carriers, trailers to transport heavy equipment, coastal and river patrol boats, tow missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, small arm ammunition and grenades, demolition munitions, and night vision devices. In a post on X, and I saw after I wrote this article that Joe Biden said this as well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken touted the package which strengthens Ukraine's air defenses. He wrote, "The United States is announcing a new military aid package to strengthen Ukraine's air defenses and support its brave forces. However, this really doesn't seem to be true. The list of weapon systems notably lacks Patriot or NAMIS interceptors and only includes the older MIM-23 Hawk and shoulder-fired Stinger missiles. As Russia has stepped up missile and bomb attacks on Ukraine, Kiev has lacked the air defenses to protect its frontline troops, cities, and key infrastructure. The advantage has allowed Russia to make territorial gains and create power outages in Ukraine. Zelensky has pleaded with members of NATO to send Patriot systems to Ukraine, but with little success in recent months. The package does include ammunition for HIMARS launchers, although the Pentagon did not specify what type of missile. The U.S. has sent Ukraine multiple types of ammunition for the HIMARS, including missiles with a range of 50 miles, a cluster variant with a range of 100 miles, and the ATACMS system with a range of nearly 200 miles. The White House recently gave Kiev the green light to use HIMARS systems to conduct attacks inside of Russia. Ukrainian officials claim that Kiev was able to take out 2 Russian missile defense systems inside Russia with missiles fired from HIMARS. Again, I don't know if this is true or not. Given Russia's ability to make the HIMARS system ineffective, it seems kind of crazy that they would be able to use this immediately and take out 2 advanced Russian air defense systems. However, it's not possible. Maybe the U.S. And Ukraine were working on some kind of development for the HIMARS missiles that would at least temporarily help them bypass some of Russia's electronic warfare and jamming systems, or something like that could have happened. A small technological upgrade that Russia will certainly find a response to, but for the time being, maybe Ukraine does take out a few Russian targets inside of Russia with these systems. All right, next up here, this from Dave DeCamp, June 9th, antiwar.com. Macron says France working to finalize plan to send troops to Ukraine. So on Friday, French President Emmanuel Macron said France was working to finalize a coalition of NATO countries that are willing to send troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces, a step that would mark a huge escalation in the proxy war. During a press conference with Ukrainian President Zelensky in Paris, Macron said Ukraine's request for NATO trainers was legitimate and downplayed the risk of escalation. So this is what Macron said. It's much more efficient and practical for certain capabilities in certain conditions to train on Ukrainian soil. It's a legitimate request. We're going to use the coming days to finalize the broadest possible coalition. He added that several NATO countries have already agreed to the plan. Moscow has said that any French trainers deployed to Ukraine would be legitimate targets of the Russian military, but Macron dismissed this warning. He said, "This is not deploying European soldiers on the front line. It's recognizing the sovereignty of Ukraine over its territory. Who will we be to give the invocations or threats or of Russia?" And so there's a couple things here that I could imagine. One is that this guy is really just a full-on idiot and doesn't understand that Russia has been hitting targets all around Ukraine and doesn't think that the Ukrainian forces are going to be in jeopardy here. Two is he's lying and knows the Ukrainian forces are going to be in jeopardy, and this is essentially a tripwire, meant to draw NATO further and deeper into this war by sacrificing a few hundred French and other NATO soldiers to a Russian attack to get more soldiers to come in. I guess he could think that Russia is actually bluffing. I have another theory here that this is somewhat of a ploy by Zelensky to get NATO to bring in more air defenses into Ukraine, and maybe even, if we're talking about training somewhere in Western Ukraine, use air defense systems from Romania, Poland, or something like that to defend these positions. So Ukraine assumes the Europeans aren't going to let their soldiers die. They'll bring in a huge number of Patriot systems, things like that, to really defend these positions to prevent it from happening. I have no idea what the thinking is going on here. If there is any thinking, it's incredibly concerning that they don't find Russia's threat seriously, or so they say, and they're willing to push forward with this massive escalation. So Dave writes here, Reuters reported on May 30th that France planned to initially send a few dozen troops to assess the training mission before sending hundreds of soldiers. The talk of sending French troops to Ukraine has highlighted the fact that there are already a small number of NATO special operator soldiers on the ground inside Ukraine, about 100 as of March 2023, but the larger public deployment will take NATO involvement in the war to the next level. The advancement of Ukraine's plan to send troops to Ukraine comes after the U.S. gave Ukraine the green light to strike Russian territory with U.S.-provided missiles, which also risks a major response from Russia. So far, the Biden administration says it has no plans to send trainers to Ukraine, but it has taken escalatory steps that it's previously ruled out throughout the conflict. So all of this happened as the European Union Parliament was planning to hold elections. Now, these elections happen throughout the entire European Union zone. I'm not going to lie and pretend that I have a deep understanding of the European Union Parliament to you here today. I have no idea how the seats are distributed or how significant it is that, say, one political party in France won the majority of France's representation to the EU Parliament. From my understanding, in typical elections, these aren't considered all that important. Maybe an American would compare it to something like a local election or something like that, as much as people really care who is in these positions. Or I think maybe a better example is, say that the Americans suddenly got to, each state got to elect like 3 representatives to go sit at somebody at the the United Nations or something like that. You can see that there maybe wouldn't be a lot of interest. So this is from Political here on the results of that election. And I write here on Twitter, National Rally victory in French EU Parliament election leads to Macron calling for elections in France. So Politico reports, European elections are not meant to be worthy but boring exercises in centrist coalition building, not this time. A surge in far-right populism in France provoked President Emmanuel Macron into calling a high-risk election that could determine the future not only of his country but the European Union itself. Across the continent, if it was a good, if unspectacular night for central and right and far right parties, and a terrible one for liberals and especially Greens. But in France, the far right national rally led by Eurosceptic and NATO skeptic firebrands completely crushed Macron's liberal Renaissance and all other contenders. National Rally is on course to win 31.5% of the vote, more than twice the 14.7% projected for Macron's Liberal Resistance Party. The high-risk gamble to regain the political initiative, Macron bet on the voters will turn back the far-right tide and show Marine Le Pen's National Rally cannot win on a national level. Macron says France needs a clear majority in serenity, and harmony. To be French at heart is about choosing to write history, not being driven by it. And so there's a few things I want to say here. It doesn't seem that this was limited to France, as they allude to in this political article. I think Belgium, Austria, and I read a few other countries have parties, including Germany, that don't typically perform as well as they perform. And one of the consistencies to me from my American reading of the situation seems to be that the parties that were most skeptical of the war in Ukraine seems to be the ones that perform the best. And so what Marcone did, and this is important because there was a lot of misunderstanding, at least in the libertarian Twitter sphere, of what happened here. Marcone isn't dissolving the European Parliament. He's dissolving what is essentially the American House of Representatives and calling a vote there. And so I don't think this really necessarily would mean that Marcone would no longer be the French president, although let's say Marine Le Pen's party does very well in these parliamentary elections. Maybe he chooses to resign or something like that out of concern that his policies aren't popular, or he doesn't think he would really be able to effectively govern given the situation that he faces. So, those things are possible. I guess we'll see what happens in the French election. The political analysis that I read is that these European Union parliamentary elections usually aren't taken seriously enough to be a really good indicator of what would happen in an actual national election in any of these countries. And so it could be that this really was a one-off. At the same time, it does kind of feel like 2016, and in the summer of 2016, before Donald Trump was elected, you also had the Brexit vote, the UK voting to separate from the European Union, the Eurozone. And so this is, pretty huge, or at least could be if this, trend continues in Europe. So let's get into the Gaza news, something I have a little bit better grasp on here. We got a lot going on in Gaza, by the way. U.S. drone flights over Gaza supported Israeli operation that killed over 200 Palestinians. So Israel received an intelligence support from the United States in a Saturday operation in central Gaza's Nusrat camp that killed over 200 Palestinians and freed 4 Israeli hostages. The intelligence support included information provided by U.S. drone flights over Gaza. The U.S. began flying MQ-9 Reaper drones over Gaza in the days after October 7th and deployed special operation forces to Israel, demonstrating that the U.S. military support for Israel goes beyond providing weapons. The Washington Post reported that a team of U.S. special operations soldiers and intelligence personnel based at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem provided intelligence support. Besides the drone flights, the U.S. provided communication intercepts, and Israel also received intelligence support from the UK. Local residents said the Israeli special forces who carried out the raids were disguised as Palestinians from Rafah, and others entered the camp in an aid truck. The Israeli military denied it used an aid truck, but the Israeli media reported Israeli soldiers were meant to blend in with Arabs as a part of the attack. Israeli warplanes pounded the refugee camp as Israeli commandos on the ground moved to locate the hostages. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, some 274 Palestinians were killed in the attack, and another 678 were wounded. Gaza's media office said 64 of the dead were children and 57 were women. The total death toll in Gaza has now surpassed 37,000. Israel claimed it killed less than 100 people in the assault, while the U.S. said it didn't know how many people died. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan celebrated the assault and also acknowledged that innocent people were killed. This is Sullivan's quote: "We, the United States, are not in a position today to make a definitive statement about that. The Israeli Defense Forces have put together one number. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry has put together another number, but we do not know this. Innocent people were tragically killed in the operation." Hamas alleged that the Israeli attack killed 3 other Israeli hostages, including an American citizen. The Palestinian group released a video of the 3 corpses, but they were unidentifiable. So we'll see if more information comes out about that. Given the number of Palestinians killed, it will almost seem inconceivable if Israel was able to conduct operations that bloody without killing any hostages. So that could be very possibly true. All right, Israel's Gantz quits war cabinet and calls for new elections. So this happened on Sunday after the 4 hostages were released. So Benny Gantz, the chair of Israel's National Unity Party, announced on Sunday that he was quitting the emergency government and war cabinet that was founded after October 7th and called for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to set a new date for elections. Gantz said Netanyahu was preventing Israel from achieving true victory in Gaza. I call on Netanyahu, set an agreed election date. Don't let our people be torn apart. The National Unity Party adds it does not force elections since Netanyahu's coalition still holds 64 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. Gantz called for others to join him, including Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who is a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, but recently called out the prime minister over a clear lack of a long-term plan for Gaza. Gantz's move comes a few weeks after he threatened to quit if Netanyahu didn't agree to a list of demands by June 8th. The demands included agreeing to establish a U.S. European Arab Palestinian administration to manage the civil affairs of Gaza alongside Israeli security control, which would mean long-term Israeli military occupation. Haaretz reported that Gantz informed the White House of his plan to quit several days ago and asked for the U.S. opinion. The report said the U.S. told Gantz that while they did not intend on intervening in Israeli politics, they note the fragile state of the hostage ceasefire talks. His departure will only lead to added pressure from the U.S. on Netanyahu. Earlier this year, Gantz visited the U.S. and met with several high-level officials, including Vice President Kamala Harris, as a part of a trip that was not approved by Netanyahu. The Haaretz report said that the U.S. officials have interviewed Gantz as their preferred interlocutor in the war cabinet. Many in the U.S. consider Gantz to be Netanyahu's moderate opposition, but one of Gantz's critiques of Netanyahu is that he didn't go into the southern Gaza city of Rafah soon enough. And so this could have some interesting implications. Israeli politics could be pretty complicated, and so I don't want to just start going around declaring that, I have a handle on what's going to happen here or anything like that. However, in a way, this could be beneficial to Israel and Netanyahu, because I think if they do, start to talk about having elections and stuff like that, it's really going to distract from what's going on in Gaza. And so who knows how bloody and evil that war could get if that isn't the main focus of what's happening in Israel and the elections become that. All right, next up, here's another one I wrote on June 7th for antiwar.com. Netanyahu address to Congress set for July 24th. So, as his coalition falls apart at home, and who knows if he's even going to be a full prime minister by then, he may just be in a caretaker role. But we do have Netanyahu giving an address in the U.S. next month. So, on Thursday, congressional leaders confirmed the Israeli prime minister will address a joint session of Congress on July 24th. Netanyahu's speech to the U.S. legislature comes as Israeli forces have killed tens of thousands of Palestinians with American weapons. Last week, bipartisan lawmakers in both chambers, including House Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries, extended an invitation to Netanyahu to speak at the Capitol. Their letter to Netanyahu said, "The existential challenges we face, including growing partnership between Iran, Russia, and China, threaten the security, peace, and prosperity of our countries and the free people around the world. To build on our enduring relationship and to highlight America's solidarity with Israel, we invite you to share the Israeli government's vision for defending democracy, combating terror, and establishing a just and lasting peace in the relationship." While the date for the speech is now set, Senator Bernie Sanders said he will not attend in protest of Israeli actions in Gaza. The senator wrote on X, Benjamin Netanyahu is creating the worst humanitarian disaster in modern history: starvation, death, destruction. We should not honor him with an invitation to address the United States Congress. Over the past 8 months, Israel has used American-provided weapons to reduce most of Gaza Strip to rubble and kill over 36,000 Palestinians. Tel Aviv has largely prevented aid from entering the besieged enclave, pushing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians towards the brink of famine. The destruction and killing of Gaza has led the International Criminal Court to seek arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. While the U.S. and Israel are not parties to the ICC, both Washington and Tel Aviv are subject to the UN's International Court of Justice, which has ruled Israel's actions in Gaza could amount to a genocide. While U.S. public opinion on Israel is trending downward, Tel Aviv has retained significant support in Congress. In April, lawmakers voted to send an additional $17 billion in military aid to Israel. A bipartisan group of representatives also went on to pass a bill that targets the ICC for prosecution of Israeli officials. A few members of Congress, including Sanders, Representative Thomas Massie, Rep. Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, have protested Israel's behavior. Those remarks have been met with stiff backlash and calls for censure and charges of anti-Semitism from their colleagues. And as far as it goes, Massie has not been quite as critical as Omar, Tlaib, or even Sanders, but still he is regularly denounced as an anti-Semite. Now, I want to say I think there's one maybe very good thing that could come of this, and that is a massive protest of this event. I think, a lot of the protests surrounding what's happened in Gaza in America have happened on the college campuses, which are currently in their summer recess. And so this will, along with the Democratic convention in Chicago, I think give a real rallying point for people who want to break America's relationship with Israel, a chance to speak out, protest, get together, and be heard. So hopefully there's already groups putting together, protests for that event. All right, next up here, one from Al Jazeera. Nearly all of Gaza's children lack food for development. So Al Jazeera reports about 90% of children in Gaza lack nutrition and face severe threats to their survival, growth, and development, according to the United Nations Agency for Children, UNICEF. A report published by UNICEF on Thursday laid bare the catastrophic impact of Israel's offensive in the enclave, which caused the collapse of the food and health systems, finding that 1 in 10 children survived on 2 or fewer food groups per day between December last year and April this year. Describing what is called an appalling escalation in nutritional deprivation, the reports also highlighted that 65% of children were fed on diets with only one or no of the preferred food groups. In February, a six-fold increase from the first half of December last year. Israel says it placed no limits on the humanitarian supplies for civilians in Gaza and has blamed the United Nations for the slow delivery, saying its operations are insufficient. But whenever aid trucks enter Gaza, Israeli forces have a pretty horrific track record of shooting, murdering, killing aid workers, and so that's a big part of the problem. Also, they've closed a lot of the border crossings, and the trucks that do get to the border crossing are often turned away by the Israelis over, inspections that find things like children's safety scissors within a truckload full of cargo, and it's rejected for that reason, or antibiotics because Hamas could take those too. Additionally, Israeli civilians are helped by the military to disrupt the aid trucks. They've attacked some of the drivers of these aid trucks and stop the trucks, destroyed the food and things in the truck, just horrible things like that. So that's a complete lie. Back to the Al Jazeera article here. But with pockets of famine emerging in Gaza, with some children dying from malnutrition and dehydration, even Israel's staunchest allies have increased pressure on it to do more to let in food. The UNICEF support said that military action, which has destroyed food systems while imposing severe restrictions on the import of commercial goods and humanitarian supplies, have deprived millions of food, water, and the fuel they need. For anybody who's watching the show, I have the graph up here that kind of goes over between December and April the number of children that have gone from eating 2 food groups a day, so that meat, dairy, vegetables, fruits, starches, wheat products, stuff like that. In December, there were 82% that were eating 2 food groups a day, and in February, that's shrunk to 30%, where it's remained. 38% are relying on 1 food group a day, and 20% have access to none of the food groups per day. So I'm not sure exactly what that means. Maybe grass really doesn't count as a food group, and animal feed and stuff like that, and that's what those children are eating on to get some calories to survive. Just an absolutely horrific situation unfolding there. And think about this too. I know a lot of people that have babies and young children and things like that, and not only are they fed at just the highest quality of food, and they're so concerned that their babies are eating and drinking, 4 sits, 8, I forget, like every 2 hours, the kids are breastfeeding and stuff like that. And you have children in Gaza whose parents, they should be getting breastfed, but they're not, because the mothers can't produce milk because they're so malnourished, and they're actually squeezing dates through like cheesecloths in order to give a kid a little bit of calories, a baby a little bit of calories that they could actually process in their bodies. It's such a horrible, unbelievably horrible situation. All right. Next up here, article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on June 9th. Biden to offer Saudi Arabia a treaty in exchange for official ties with Israel. So the White House is prepared to roll out a plan that will make Saudi Arabia a Japan-style ally in exchange for Riyadh developing official ties with Tel Aviv. While the Biden administration has invested substantial effort to get the deal inked, it is likely dead on arrival because Saudi Arabia refuses to normalize with Israel unless Tel Aviv agrees to the creation of a Palestinian state. According to American, Israeli, and Saudi officials speaking with the Wall Street Journal, Washington is prepared to sign an agreement to defend Saudi Arabia if Riyadh will establish regular ties with Tel Aviv. However, it would not be a peace agreement, as the two countries are not at war, even though that's going to be how it's portrayed in the mainstream media. Several hurdles must be cleared before the deal can be finalized, and that is unlikely to happen. As Biden is seeking to make Saudi Arabia a treaty ally, it would need the approval of 2/3 of the Senate. That Saudi Arabia may be able to do, although I do have some questions if they could do it, because there are senators, Rand Paul, Mike Lee on the Republican side, who might object to this. And then there could be a significant number of senators on the Democrat side, even though this is Biden's proposal, that could remember what Saudi Arabia did to the people of Yemen and things like that, and decide that we don't want to be treaty allies with a kingdom that, doesn't have women's rights or gay rights or things like that. Additionally, the deal would require Tel Aviv to end the onslaught in Gaza and take permanent steps towards a Palestinian state. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has refused to take either step. Despite the obvious obstacles to the agreement, the Joe Biden administration has pressed forward with negotiations. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan explained last month, "We should not miss a historic opportunity to achieve the vision of secure Israel, flanked by strong regional partners, presented as a powerful front to deter aggression and uphold regional stability. We are pursuing this vision every day." Now, the problem and what I think is actually going on here is, for Biden, he does have liberal supporters who I don't think like what's going on in Gaza, but also aren't, going to rallies about it and stuff like that. And to keep these people compliant, the Biden administration has to have some kind of post-Palestinian plan for when the Israelis are done with their military operations in Gaza. And so presenting this vague plan of the Saudis and the Arabs are going to help rebuild Gaza after the Israelis pull out, and this is going to lead to a Palestinian state normalization, peace in the region, is this, huge fantasy. It's never going to happen, but at least the Biden administration, from their perspective, has some kind of thing that they could offer to the American people as a potential way through this conflict. If it went through, it would make Riyadh Washington's only treaty ally in the Arab world, a status that even Tel Aviv does not have. The deal would also give the U.S. access to Saudi airspace and would also require Saudi Arabia to limit Chinese activity in Saudi Arabia. The treaty is also part of negotiations of a larger deal that would see the U.S. transfer nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. For President Biden, the deal could be politically problematic. As a candidate, Biden promised that he would treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah state for the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. To add to the potential domestic resistance to the agreement, there is widespread protests in the U.S. against Biden's support for Israel amid the war on Gaza, as the treaty is a bribe to Riyadh to accept official relations with Tel Aviv. Americans may object to becoming an ally with Saudi Arabia to secure Israel's regional interest. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Again, a lot of stuff coming up this week. Connor Freeman returns to the show tomorrow morning, so don't miss that. Subscribe to the show. Share this show, more so than usual. I'd like this show to get out there just because, this one is a little bit more personal with myself being put on the anti-Ukraine list. And 3, don't miss my appearance coming up this week on Judge Napolitano, Judging Freedom, 2 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, June 12th. Thanks, everyone.